Houston, we have a problem. Do you know where those words come from? 21 years ago, they were spoken by Tom Hanks' character in the movie Apollo 13. And then 33 years ago, in 1983, NASA had a radio program about space history that went under that title. And then in 1974, even earlier, there was a made-for-TV movie that had the title, Houston, We Have a Problem. And what's interesting is that those words were never spoken by the astronauts on Apollo 13. At least not with that verb tense. The actual exchange went like this. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say it again, please. Houston, we've had a problem. That's not a big difference, moving from the past perfect tense to the simple perfect tense. But we always want to be precise in these matters, right? But long before Apollo 13, many years before that tragedy, there was another tragedy that occurred. And we read about it in Genesis 3. Our first parents were hanging out in a garden. They were getting rather curious about a particular tree. And then all of a sudden, you hear these words. Eden, we have a problem here. And the Lord says, this is Eden. Say again, please. Eden, we have a problem. Adam and Eve have gone missing. I'll go check it out. And so when the Lord arrives on the scene, Adam and Eve are nowhere to be found. They've gone into hiding. Now, at the beginning of creation, human beings were created by God in the image of God to be the image bearers of God in creation. That human beings were to serve as the presence of God in creation and to be stewards over creation. But when our first parents ate from that tree, something happened. They became so overwhelmed by shame and guilt that they went into hiding. And they could no longer be the image bearers of God in creation. They couldn't even bear to be in the presence of God. And so there was a problem. And the question is, how is God going to fix it? Because it's not a simple problem. So what does God do? Well, let's return to Houston. And I'm going to follow the plot of the movie line because it's more interesting than what really happened. What really happened is interesting, but the movie line makes it a little more dramatic, right? So the problem is that a couple of oxygen tanks explode. And so there's not enough oxygen, enough clean air to make the trip all the way around the moon and back to the Earth. But when the oxygen tanks exploded, they also took out a couple of fuel cells. So now the question is there going to be enough power to get these three astronauts back home? And so they decide to shut off the command module, turn off all the electricity of that to conserve some of it, which means that it's dark and cold. And then at some point, they're going to have to turn it back on. But here's the problem. There's not enough amps to do it. So in the movie, they go get Ken Mattingly out of bed, who had been scrapped from the mission because he had been exposed to measles. He ended up not coming down from measles. And they usher him back to Houston, and he goes into the simulator because they they've got to go through and come up with procedures. Now, in actual fact, they have these procedures outlined in real life, but they did send people in to go over them, to make sure that there wasn't going to be any confusion and that the instructions were right. But King Mattingly goes in and he says this: "I need the simulator cold and dark. Give me the exact same conditions they got in there right now." And then he turns to somebody and he says, "I need a flashlight." And they hand him a flashlight and he says, "That's not what they have up there. Don't give me anything that they don't have on board." When Jesus came to repair and restore our humanity, he came by becoming one of us. And by becoming one of us in every way. Essentially, he said the same thing. Give me the exact same conditions that they have now. Don't give me anything that they don't possess. And so when the Son of God becomes incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, he starts out with the exact same conditions that sinful, broken humanity has. He's born and he grows and develops like any human being. He's also destined to die. He will not get out of this world alive. He has the same human weaknesses, the same human frailties. He gets sick. He gets hungry. He gets thirsty. He needs rest. He experiences anger. He experiences fear. He experiences temptations. And he faces those temptations with exactly what we have. So he starts out with the exact same situation, the exact same conditions. Except for one thing. At his baptism, he is given God's Spirit. But the Spirit is not like a magic wand that makes everything easy. The Spirit comes inside of Jesus. And together, the Spirit and Jesus return humanity, restore humanity from the inside out. When Jesus goes into the wilderness and confronts Satan, he doesn't do so with the Son of God power that he had in heaven. He goes in fully human with the Spirit, but goes through the same sort of temptations that we face. For 40 days he goes without food and water, and then he's hungry. And when Satan comes to test him, to tempt him, and says, you know, if you're the Son of God, you could turn these stones into bread. It's the same sort of temptation that he gave Adam and Eve. You know, you could eat this. It would be good for you. But Jesus looks and says, it's written, people don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And for Jesus, it's not a platitude. It's not just something that he read in the Old Testament and thought this would be a good time to share it. For 40 days and 40 nights, he had learned this truth. That people don't live by bread alone. That people really do live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And he can speak that truth with authenticity. Because he endured those temptations in his full humanity. So part of way in which God solves the problem of Eden is by becoming one with us, becoming so fully identified with us in our humanity that through his humanity, empowered by the Spirit, Jesus can find a way out of the quagmire that we're in. There's something else that Jesus does that I think is important. I want to go back to the movie. The other problem in the movie is that they don't have enough oxygen, enough clean air. The carbon dioxide is building up in the command module. And so they've got to figure out how to filter the air, how to filter the carbon dioxide out of the air. I don't know if you remember the movie, but there's this wonderful scene where there are a bunch of engineers around the table, and somebody comes in carrying all of these things, tape, tubes, filters that are not the right size, and just throws everything on the table. And I can't remember exactly if it was a square filter that they only had a round filter for or whatever, but they basically said, we've got to create a filter out of all of this stuff. And we can only use the things that they actually have up there. So what they end up doing is retrofitting, creating a new filter from what was existing so that the air can be clean. When the Spirit comes upon Jesus at his baptism, he doesn't just guide and empower Jesus in his ministry. The Spirit is also learning. The Spirit is also learning what it means to live within humanity. Because when Jesus leaves, he doesn't leave us orphaned. He leaves us the Holy Spirit. The same Spirit that empowered him in life and ministry. And this Spirit, in a sense, acclimated to human beings. That in the very person of Jesus, it wasn't just that the Spirit was helping Jesus. Jesus was also helping the Spirit become what the Spirit needed to become in order to dwell in all human beings. Human beings that are weak, human beings that get afraid. And that was God's vision. That's how God was going to restore humanity. That's how God was going to give us back our vocation of being the image bearers in creation. He said in the Old Testament, there will come a day where there will be a new covenant, and I will put a new spirit within human beings. And they will finally be able to follow me. And we will once again they will be my people, and I will be their God. So as you go throughout this season of Lent, and as you go throughout life, as you face temptations, as you confront your own weaknesses and limitations, it may be of some comfort to know that Jesus knows what we go through because he's been there. There may also be some comfort to know that when he left his Spirit to be with us. A Spirit that was perfectly fitted and retrofitted to dwell within human beings. A Spirit that would give us life. A Spirit that would pray in us when we no longer knew